She was a billionaire real estate mogul who owned half the skyline. He was a humble roadside mechanic who owned nothing but the oil on his hands. But when her luxury sedan gave up the ghost on a desolate stretch of road, their two worlds collided in a shower of radiator steam and rising tempers. What started as a simple engine failure would soon ignite a war of betrayal, corporate espionage, and a love that neither of them saw coming. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. The dusty heat of the road near a jetty was a physical weight, pressing down on Amanda Peters until the sweat began to ruin her light nude makeup. She stood by her stalled sedan, a vision of corporate perfection in a striking red power dress, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of parched grass and distant, crumbling mud brick houses. Her heels clicked impatiently on the asphalt as she paced in a tight circle, her phone held high toward the cloudless sky in a desperate search for even a single bar of signal. "Out of all days, why today?" she whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of panic and fury. This was the day of the bidding for the massive agro-processing space, a deal that would cement her legacy as the most powerful real estate mogul in Lagos. Yet here she was, defeated by a drunk goat sound from under her own bonnet. She had just reached the point of genuine despair when she heard the rhythmic, unhurried sound of footsteps. She turned, her hand instinctively clutching her designer bag, and saw him. He was tall and dark, his frame draped in a faded jumpsuit stained heavily with the dark iridescent streaks of engine oil. A tattered towel was slung across his shoulder, and his face held a rugged, unbothered expression that suggested he lived in a world where deadlines didn't exist. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who had seen 1,000 cars die on this road and felt no particular pity for any of them. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice smooth and calm, cutting through her frantic energy like early morning pap. Amanda exhaled a jagged breath, gesturing toward the open bonnet with a manic sort of frustration. "It just stopped. Completely dead. I have the most important meeting of my career in less than an hour, and this car has decided to disgrace me in the middle of nowhere." She waited for the inevitable, the look of greed, the predatory smile of a man who knew he had a billionaire in a corner. But it didn't come. Brother Tund merely nodded and stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Can I take a look?" he requested. For a woman who usually demanded 3 references and a background check before letting anyone touch her property, Amanda didn't hesitate. She stepped aside, watching as he leaned into the engine bay as if he were whispering to an old friend. He checked the oil stick with a practiced flick of his wrist and touched the radiator cap, his brow furrowing slightly. "Your oil is bone dry, and the water is low," he said, looking back at her with an unreadable expression. "You're lucky the engine didn't knock completely." Amanda winced, remembering her driver's 2 a.m. text about a scattered stomach that had forced her to drive herself. "I think I have oil in the boot," she said, hurrying to the back of the car. When she produced the bottle, she held it out to him like a sacred offering. Tund took it quietly, pouring the fluid in with a steady hand that didn't spill a single drop on her pristine engine. "I'll get water from the compound nearby," he told her, already turning to walk away before she could even offer to go with him. His back moved with the effortless grace of a man who owed life no apologies, leaving Amanda standing in the dust, blinking in surprise. 10 minutes later, he returned with a heavy plastic keg, pouring the water carefully into the radiator while wiping his greasy brow with a towel on his shoulder. "Start it now," he commanded. Amanda slid into the driver's seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned the ignition, and the car purred into life, the sound smooth and satisfied. A smile broke across her face, the first genuine emotion she had felt all day, and she jumped out of the car, her heels sinking slightly into the soft dirt. "Oh my God, thank you. Thank you so much," she cried, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a thick wad of crisp high-denomination Naira notes, the kind of money that could feed a village family for months. She thrust the cash toward him, expecting his eyes to widen, expecting the typical Lagos scramble for a windfall. Brother Tund looked at the money, then looked at her. He slowly shook his head, a faint, almost pitying smile touching his lips. No need, he said casually, wiping his hands on his trousers. I didn't do anything special. Just oil and water. Keep your money. Amanda froze, her arm still extended. In her world, everything had a price, and every kindness was a transaction waiting to be settled. You're sure? She stammered, her voice sounding small even to her own ears. I'm sure, he replied, already turning to head back toward the path leading to the village. He didn't look back. He didn't ask for her name, her number, or a tip. Amanda stood there by her running car, the dusty wind whipping her red dress around her knees, watching the mechanic disappear into the haze of the afternoon heat. She had just been given a gift she didn't know how to process, a moment of mercy that her billions couldn't have bought. The cool, recycled air of the Peters Holdings skyscraper was a sharp, clinical contrast to the memory of the dusty roadside heat that still seemed to cling to Amanda's skin. She sat in her executive chair, the leather smooth and expensive against her back, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the chaotic beauty of Victoria Island. Below her, Lagos moved in a frantic, shimmering blur of yellow buses and silver SUVs, but her mind was anchored miles away, back at that desolate junction where her engine had failed. On her mahogany desk lay the signed land deal documents, the hard-won prize of her afternoon's battle in E80, but the triumph felt hollow. Usually, a win of this magnitude would warrant a celebratory dinner at a five-star restaurant or a toast with her board of directors, yet all she could think about was the man with the towel over his shoulder and grease beneath his fingernails. She picked up a gold-plated pen, intending to sign off on a series of acquisition reports, but her hand remained still. Instead of seeing the projected revenue figures, she saw the way Brother Tund had looked at her stack of cash with an expression that wasn't awe, but a quiet, almost unsettling indifference. In her world, money was the ultimate language, the tool she used to bend reality to her will. People looked at her and saw a billionaire, a titan, a woman to be feared or fleeced. Tund had looked at her and seen a woman with a broken car. That was all. A soft knock at the door broke her trance. Chisholm, her chief operating officer and closest friend, walked in with a tablet tucked under her arm and a knowing smirk on her face. You've been staring at that same spot on the glass for 5 minutes, Amanda, Chisholm noted, leaning against the desk and crossing her arms. The land deal is closed, the investors are happy, and you look like you're mourning a loss. Who is he? Amanda scoffed, finally dropping the pen and leaning back. Please, Chisholm. There is no he. I'm just thinking about the logistics of the new project. Liar, Chisholm laughed, her eyes scanning her friend's face with surgical precision. Amanda Peters, the woman who once fired a consultant for wearing the wrong shade of blue, is currently distracted daydreaming, and, is that a blush? Something definitely happened on that road today. The car broke down, Amanda said, trying to regain her professional composure. A local mechanic helped me. That's all. It was just an interesting encounter. Interesting enough that you've touched exactly 0% of the paperwork I left for you an hour ago. Chisholm teased, raising a perfectly groomed eyebrow. She moved closer, her tone softening. You've been in a war for 10 years, Amanda. You've built an empire. But when was the last time someone did something for you without asking for a seat at the table afterward? That was the question that haunted her. As the evening sun began to dip behind the Atlantic, casting long golden shadows across her office, Amanda realized that Tund hadn't just fixed her car, he had cracked the foundation of her worldview. She was a woman who lived by the philosophy of the test. She tested her employees' loyalty, her partner's integrity, and her rivals' weaknesses. She had offered Tund a fortune as a test of his greed, and for the first time in her life, the subject had failed to follow the script. He didn't want her money. He didn't want her gratitude. He didn't even want her name. She stood up abruptly, grabbing her designer bag. I'm leaving early, she announced, surprising even herself. It's only 5 o'clock, Chisholm remarked, checking her watch. Where are you going? The charity gala starts at 8. I need peace, Amanda replied, her voice trailing off as she reached the door. Peace has a name, doesn't it? Chisholm called out after her, but Amanda was already halfway to the elevator. The drive back to her penthouse was a blur. Usually, she took the time to review market trends or make international calls, but tonight, she left the radio off. She found herself checking the oil light on her dashboard with a strange, lingering anxiety, her mind replaying the moment Tun's hands had moved over her engine with that effortless, masterful grace. He was a mystery she couldn't solve, a variable she hadn't accounted for. Why would a man living in the dust of a village, likely struggling for his next meal, turn away enough money to change his life? Was he truly that selfless, or was it a different kind of pride? She reached her apartment and bypassed the wine cellar, heading straight for the balcony. The city lights of Lagos were a sea of diamonds, but her thoughts drifted back to the evil silence of the remote road and the man who had broken it. She felt a restless energy vibrating in her chest, a need to return to that junction not as the billionaire in the red dress, but as someone who could look Tund in the eye without a stack of naira between them. She was obsessed with the idea of the real Tund. No one was that pure, she told herself. Everyone had a secret. Perhaps he hadn't taken the money because he knew she was a billionaire and was playing a longer, more dangerous game. Or perhaps, as Chisholm suggested, he was simply the first real thing she had encountered in a very long time. Amanda looked at her reflection in the sliding glass door. The red dress looked like a costume now, a suit of armor for a war she was tired of fighting. She made a decision then, one that went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. She wouldn't send a private investigator. She wouldn't send a corporate scout. She would go back herself. She would shed the power dress, the heels, and the billionaire's mask. She would find out if Brother Tund was truly a man of mercy, or if he was just another ghost in the machine of her life. The transformation began in the quiet of her walk-in closet, a space usually reserved for organizing silk blazers and Italian leather pumps. Amanda Peters stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, peeling off the remnants of her billionaire identity. The red power dress was draped over a chair, looking like a discarded skin, replaced by a pair of soft, faded jeans and a simple navy blue blouse that didn't scream of a designer label. She hesitated for a moment before kicking off her signature heels and sliding her feet into a pair of plain black flats. The change in height felt symbolic, as if she were literally lowering herself to the earth she had spent years looking down upon from the windows of skyscrapers. She removed her diamond studs, wiped away the sharp lines of her makeup, and pulled her hair back into a functional ponytail. Looking at her reflection, she no longer saw the titan of Peter's holding. She saw a woman who could pass for a traveler, a visitor, or perhaps just someone searching for a moment of truth. She drove herself again, navigating the transition from the paved, orderly streets of Victoria Island to the increasingly rugged roads that led away from the city's heart. No driver sat in the front seat to open her door, and no assistant managed her schedule on a tablet in the passenger seat. As the Lagos skyline faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the orange dust and sprawling greenery of the remote outskirts, Amanda felt a strange mix of liberation and anxiety. She didn't need a GPS. The memory of that road, the exact spot where the complete evil silence of her engine had first occurred, was etched into her mind with startling clarity. When she finally reached the dusty junction in Ajeti, the sky was already beginning to tilt toward the soft, bruised purple of evening. She parked her car at the same spot where her engine had betrayed her, stepping out into the dry heat that felt less like a slap today and more like a familiar greeting. The village was stirring with the quiet energy of the day's end. She followed the path Tund had taken when he went to fetch water, her flats crunching against the parched earth. The silence here was different from the silence of her office. It was filled with the distant bleating of goats and the laughter of children chasing a plastic bottle as if it were a trophy made of gold. She eventually reached a modest compound with a rusted gate and knocked, her heart thumping with a rhythm that was entirely uncorporate. The gate creaked open to reveal an elderly woman with a wrapper tied firmly around her waist and a gaze that was sharp enough to cut through Amanda's casual disguise. This was Mama Mary. She adjusted her wrapper and looked Amanda up and down, her eyes lingering on the quality of Amanda's skin and the expensive glint of her watch that she had forgotten to remove. The suspicion in the older woman's eyes was immediate and heavy. "Yes? Who are you looking for?" Mama Mary asked, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had seen many strangers pass through her village and trusted very few of them. "Good evening, Ma," Amanda said, trying to modulate her voice to sound less like a CEO giving an order and more like a person seeking a favor. "I'm looking for the man who helped me the other day. My car broke down just up the road, and he was kind enough to fix it without asking for anything in return. I wanted to thank him properly." Mama Mary didn't soften. She leaned against the gate post, her eyes narrowed. "Many people come here asking for favors. Why does a fine lady like you care about a roadside mechanic? Is it only your engine you want him to check?" The bluntness of the question caught Amanda off guard, a rare occurrence in a world where people usually couch their insults in corporate jargon. I was impressed by his character," Amanda replied honestly, finding that the truth was the only currency that might work here. "He wouldn't take my money. I've lived in Lagos a long time, Ma, and I've never met a man like that. I brought some supplies, things for his shop." Mama Mary stared at her for a long, uncomfortable minute, searching for the lie. Finally, she sighed and gestured down a narrowing path that led toward a cluster of trees and a makeshift shelter. "That should be Brother Tund. He is my nephew. He doesn't like trouble, and he doesn't like people who bring it." She pointed a gnarled finger toward a blue umbrella in the distance. "His shop is down there. You will see the tires. But listen to me, Lagos lady. Tund has already had his heart broken by people who wear fine clothes. Don't go adding to his burden." The warning chilled Amanda more than any market crash ever could. She thanked the woman and began the walk toward the blue umbrella, her mind racing with Mama Mary's words. Tund wasn't just a mechanic. He was a man with a messy past and a family that guarded him like a treasure. As she approached the shop, she saw him. He was crouched beside a rusty vehicle, deep in conversation with a younger boy, Matthew, his apprentice, who was holding a wrench as if it were a scepter. Tund looked up as the shadow of her approach fell over his work. He stood slowly, wiping his greasy hands on a rag, his eyes traveling from her plain flats up to her face. For a moment, there was no recognition, only the calm, unreadable gaze of a man at peace with his surroundings. Then, his brow lifted slightly. "You," he said, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 questions. Amanda smiled, feeling a sudden, inexplicable rush of relief. "Me. I told you I'd be back to thank you properly." She held up a small gift bag, not filled with the crisp Naira notes he had rejected, but with high-quality engine oil, heavy-duty gloves, and industrial wipes. It was a gesture of respect for his craft, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than indifference in his eyes. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a worn wooden bench under the shade of the umbrella. As Amanda sat, she realized the test had shifted. She wasn't the one examining him anymore. Surrounded by the dust of a jetty and the watchful eyes of the village, she was the one being tested. The dusty air of a jetty was thick with more than just the scent of dry earth and exhaust fumes that evening. It was heavy with the palpable weight of eyes. As Amanda sat on the low, weathered wooden bench beneath Tund's blue umbrella, she was acutely aware that she had become the village's primary spectacle. Across the red dirt road, near the small provision store where a rusted Coca-Cola sign hung precariously, Mama Amaka and 2 other women stood in a tight cluster, their wrappers tied firmly around their waists. They were not even pretending to look elsewhere. Every time Amanda shifted her weight or Tund leaned in to explain a mechanical detail, the women's heads would incline toward one another, their whispers punctuated by sharp, knowing glances that skipped across the road like stones on water. Mama Amaka, the self-appointed gatekeeper of village news, adjusted the tray of garden eggs on her head and tapped the woman beside her. They watched as Amanda, the Lagos lady, sat with her legs crossed at the ankles, her simple navy blouse failing to hide the poise of someone who usually gave orders from the top floor of a skyscraper. To them, the sight was a riddle that didn't fit the local logic. Why was a woman with skin that looked like it had never known a day of hard sun sitting in the dirt with a man whose hands were permanently stained by the inner workings of old engines? "You see her watch," Mama Amaka whispered, her voice carrying just enough to be a low hum in the distance. That small thing on her wrist can buy 3 of Tun's shops. She is not here for car trouble today. The other women nodded in unison, the kind of slow, calculating nod only seasoned village women could pull off, while their eyes remained fixed on the bench. Under the umbrella, Tun seemed remarkably unbothered by the audience, though Amanda could see the slight tightening of his jaw as he worked on a carburetor. He didn't look at the women, but he was clearly aware of the ripples Amanda's presence was causing in the quiet pond of his existence. "I told you," he said softly, his voice barely rising above the clink of metal against metal. "You've caused ripples. By tomorrow, they will have decided whether you are a long-lost cousin or a secret wife I brought from the city." Amanda smiled faintly, reaching for the bottle of water she had brought, noticing how the simple movement drew another flurry of whispers from across the road. "Let them talk," she replied, her own voice dropping to match his. "In Lagos, people talk behind glass walls and through legal memos. At least here, I can see the gossip happening in real time." She looked at Tund, really looked at him, noticing the way his unfairly long eyelashes cast shadows on his cheekbones as he focused on his task. The conversation shifted into the small things that made up a life, the stories that didn't make it into a billionaire's portfolio. Tund spoke about growing up in the village, the peace he found in the rhythm of the seasons, and why he had eventually returned after a stint in the city. He mentioned a messy past with a bitterness that he tried to hide behind a shrug, but Amanda caught the flash of pain in his eyes. She, in turn, told him about her world, but not in the sharp, clipped tones of a CEO. She spoke of the war she fought every day in high heels and suits, and how, sitting here in the dust, she felt like she could finally breathe for the first time in years. Nearby, Matthew, the young apprentice, sat on a worn tire, peeling groundnuts and watching the exchange with a mischievous grin. He was the bridge between the quiet bench and the buzzing village, and he knew exactly what the women were saying. "Oga," Matthew chimed in, tossing a nut into the air and catching it in his mouth. "Mama Amaka is already asking if she should start preparing yam porridge for the introduction ceremony." Tund finally looked up, throwing a playful glare at the boy. "Fix that brake pad before I throw you inside the engine," he muttered, though the edge was missing from his voice. He turned back to Amanda, his expression softening. "They aren't used to seeing someone like you just sitting. In their world, everyone is running after something. They don't understand someone who just wants to stay for a while." As the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in shades of fire and gold, the village women finally began to disperse, though their eyes lingered until the very last moment. The Lagos lady had survived her first full afternoon of village scrutiny, but the ripples were only beginning to spread. Amanda realized that she wasn't just testing Tund anymore. She was being drawn into a world where status was measured by character and loyalty rather than bank balances. And as Tund wiped his hands on a rag and offered her a small, rare smile, the billionaire felt a strange, terrifying sense of belonging that no boardroom victory had ever provided. The air between them, once filled with the rhythmic clink of tools and the soft hum of shared stories, suddenly turned cold and sharp as a blade. Amanda had spoken with the polished, strategic fervor of a woman used to winning, but she failed to realize that her offer of legal backing and financial support sounded less like a rescue and more like a trap to a man who had been hollowed out by the powerful. Tund stepped back, dropping the grease-stained rag as if it had become hot to the touch. His eyes, which had softened over the past few weeks, narrowed into slits of suspicion as he truly looked at her, really looked at the way she stood, the way she spoke, and the inherent authority she couldn't fully hide even in her simple clothes. "Stop," Tund's voice cut through her words, low and bitter, vibrating with a frequency that made Amanda's breath hitch in her throat. He didn't see a friend anymore. He saw a billionaire, a titan of the same Lagos world that had chewed him up and spat him out into the dust of a jetty. "You're just like them, aren't you? You didn't just happen to break down on this road. You're connected to the same circles, the same boardrooms where people like Victor and Muna eat lunch while they decide which lives to ruin." Amanda tried to reach out, her hand trembling slightly. "Tund, it's not like that. I am fighting the same person. Victor is my enemy too." But her defense only seemed to fuel his fire. He gave a short, jagged laugh that held no humor, only the echoes of old wounds being ripped open. He began to pace the small area under the blue umbrella, his movements no longer calm but jagged, like a trapped animal sensing a predator in the shadows. He accused her of showing up out of nowhere, suggesting that her presence was a calculated move rather than a twist of fate. To a man who had lost his empire to a woman he shared a bed with, Amanda's sudden kindness felt like the ultimate Trojan horse. "I didn't ask you to come here," he snapped, his voice rising just enough to make Matthew, his apprentice, look up in alarm from the corner of the shop. "I didn't ask for your help, your supplies, or your financial support. Every time someone from your world offers help, there is a hidden price tag. You want to use my story to hurt your rival. You want to use me as a witness, a pawn, a weapon in your own war." The accusation stung Amanda more than any corporate betrayal she had ever endured. She had come to him for peace, but she had inadvertently brought the very war she was trying to escape right to his doorstep. Amanda stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That's not fair, Tund. I've shown you who I am. I've sat in this dust with you for weeks. Does that look like a corporate game to you?" Tund stopped pacing and looked her dead in the eye, his face hardening into a mask of stone. "I don't trust any of you anymore," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "I've been burned, lied to, and robbed blind by people who smiled just like you do. I thought this village was the one place where I could be just a mechanic, but you've turned me back into a target. You've brought the smell of Lagos back into my life, and I want it gone." He stepped closer, the heat of his anger radiating off him. "I want you to leave, Amanda. Stop coming here. Go back to your glass office and your billionaires. Leave me to my peace." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic thumping of someone pounding yam in a nearby compound. Amanda felt the shattered trust, like a physical weight in her chest. She realized that by revealing her power, she had accidentally confirmed his greatest fear, that no one is truly just anything, and that everyone has a hidden agenda. There was no argument she could make that wouldn't sound like another sales pitch. She simply nodded, her throat tightening so much she couldn't speak. She turned and walked away, her flats crunching softly on the red earth, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back. Not the gaze of a man who loved her, but the gaze of a man who felt he was being hunted again. She drove back to Lagos in a blur of tears and frustration, the city lights looking like cold, distant stars. For the next several days, she retreated into a sadness and silence that even Chisholm couldn't crack. She sat by her window in Victoria Island, staring at the Atlantic and thinking of the man who had asked her to go. She had offered him a way out, but in doing so, she had reminded him why he had run away in the first place. She had been just kind, but as Chisholm would later tell her, kindness is a terrifying thing to people who are used to war. Amanda Peters, the woman who owned the skyline, felt smaller and more defeated than she ever had during a hostile takeover. She had lost the one thing her billions couldn't replace, the fragile, honest trust of a man who fixed cars with his soul. The silence in Ajeti was heavy that evening, a gray and stagnant weight that seemed to settle over the workshop like the dust Amanda had left in her wake. Brother Tund stood in front of his workbench, the usual rhythmic sounds of his labor replaced by a hollow mechanical repetition. He picked up a long-handled spanner, his movements robotic. He wiped the tool with a rag, polished the chrome until it shone, and then, without realizing it, started again. He cleaned that same spanner 3 times in total, his eyes fixed on the empty road where a certain luxury car was no longer parked. He was a man who had built his life on the logic of machines, yet he found himself unable to fix the grinding gears of his own heart. His apprentice, Matthew, sat on a worn tire nearby, peeling groundnuts with a focus that was unusually quiet for a boy who usually had a joke for every situation. Matthew watched his boss closely, noting the way Tund's shoulders slumped and the way he stared into the distance as if waiting for a ghost. "Oga," Matthew said at last, his voice breaking the stillness of the shop. "You've cleaned that same tool enough to make it disappear, and you're not even fixing anything." Tund didn't answer, his hand frozen mid-wipe. Matthew grinned softly, throwing a groundnut into his mouth. "So, it's true. You miss the Lagos lady. You see, you're not even shouting at me for being lazy. That means I'm right." Tund finally dropped the spanner, the metallic clang echoing through the quiet village air. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked out at the path leading to the main road. The air felt heavier tonight, and his chest felt tighter than a rusted bolt. He had asked for peace, had demanded that she leave him to his quiet life, but now that the peace had arrived, it felt like a prison. He realized that his anger hadn't been directed at Amanda, but at the fear she had awakened, the fear that he might actually want to trust someone again. That night, he went home earlier than usual, the shadows of his small compound feeling longer and colder than before. He sat on his bed, the dim light of a single bulb casting flickering shadows on the walls. He picked up his phone, a device he usually treated with indifference, and stared at it for several long minutes. He went to his contacts, scrolling down to the number he had told himself he had no business saving. His thumb hovered over the call button. He thought of the architects of shadows, of Folashade and Victor, and the way the world had once robbed him blind. But then he thought of Amanda sitting in the dust in her navy blouse, looking at him as if he were the most important person in the world. He dialed. The ringtone seemed to vibrate through his entire body. It rang once, twice, and then a click. "Hello," Amanda's voice came through, soft and cautious, like wind slipping through a silk curtain. Tund took a deep, shaky breath, closing his eyes. "It's me," he said, his voice raspy with the weight of the things he had struggled to say. "Tund." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. "I know," she whispered. "I'm sorry," Tund said, the words feeling foreign yet necessary. "For the way I spoke to you. For the things I said. It wasn't fair." He leaned his head against the cool cement wall of his room. "I've forgotten how to trust, Amanda. I'm not used to someone showing up and staying without asking for something in return. You didn't deserve to be treated like an enemy." In her apartment in Victoria Island, Amanda stood by the window, the city lights of Lagos blinking lazily in the distance. Her heart, which had held onto the sting of his words for days, suddenly felt a lightness she hadn't expected. The call was awkward and short, but it was a bridge. "Can we talk?" Tund asked, his voice dropping lower, almost a plea. "I don't want the war, Amanda. I just want small peace. But maybe I don't have to find it alone." "Okay," Amanda replied, her own voice dropping to match his. The conversation ended soon after, but the silence that followed wasn't the complete evil silence of a broken engine. It was a quietness filled with possibility. For the next few days, the dynamic shifted. Tund began to call her, not to apologize again, but just to ask about her day or if she had eaten. He even joked once about seeing a woman who looked like her but was frowning too much to be the real Amanda. 3 weeks after their bitter parting, Amanda found herself driving toward Ijeti once again. This time, she wasn't testing him, and she wasn't hiding behind a disguise. She pulled up to the shop and saw Tund sitting outside, his shirt cleaner than usual, sipping a malt drink. He stood as she stepped out of the car. He didn't smile wide, but his eyes were bright with a welcome that no money could buy. "Are you still here to fight my enemies?" he asked with a faint smile. Amanda chuckled, leaning against her car. "Only if you let me." Tund shook his head slowly, gesturing to the wooden bench. "Maybe we should start with that small piece first. Sit down." As they sat together, the ripples in the dust finally began to settle into a new quiet pattern of trust. The transition from the dusty benches of Ijeti to the clinical glass-walled conference rooms of Ikoyi was a jarring shift for Brother Tund, but Amanda held his hand through the change with the steady grip of a seasoned commander. He arrived at the prestigious law firm of Mr. Elvis wearing a crisp shirt and clean jeans, clutching a weathered brown envelope that contained the remains of his former life, old sketches, dated emails, and trademark filings that had been gathering dust for years. Mr. Elvis, a man with a voice as soft as velvet but a presence as sharp as a razor's edge, received them with a nod that signaled the end of Tund's exile. "We've been expecting you," the lawyer said, and as they sat across from him, the weight on Tun's shoulders began to melt under the glow of the overhead LED lights. The legal battle did not start with a shout, but with a slow storm of paperwork that hit GT engines like a tidal wave. Victor Muna, ever the arrogant titan, initially responded through his lawyers with a dismissive letter calling the claims baseless. He was a man who believed his deep pockets and deep connections made him untouchable, but he had underestimated the combination of Tun's technical brilliance and Amanda's strategic fury. Mr. Elvis fired back with a motion to freeze GT's entire production line until the case was resolved, a move so aggressive that Victor finally stopped laughing and started paying attention. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was charged with a tension that felt like the air before a lightning strike. Victor Muna walked in with a face so smooth it looked like it rejected wrinkles out of pride, flanked by 5 lawyers and a suitcase full of carefully constructed lies. He wore his suit like he was born inside it, casting a disdainful glance at Tund as if he were still just a local mechanic who had lost his way. But the power shift occurred the moment Mr. Elvis stood up to present the evidence. "My client didn't just dream of these designs," Mr. Elvis began, his voice echoing through the silent chamber. "He documented every stage of the invention." He began to lay out the literal receipts, a chronological trail of evidence that Victor could not bribe or bully his way out of. There were timestamps from a local internet cafe in 2017 where Tund had emailed early prototypes to himself, and even a blurry old newspaper article featuring Tund's face beside a preliminary model of the engine Victor claimed to have invented a year later. As the documents were passed to the judge, the courtroom went deathly still. The judge peered over his spectacles, looking from the papers to the man in the expensive suit. "So, Mr. Muna," the judge said, his tone dry and dangerous, "you claim to have designed this engine in 2018, but this photo clearly shows Brother Tund with the working prototype in 2017. Is this your signature here on the filing?" Victor swallowed hard, his composed mask finally beginning to crack. He looked at Amanda, who stared back with a cold, unwavering smile, the smile of a woman who knew exactly what happened when you brought a knife to a gunfight. "It was, photocopied wrongly," Victor stammered, a beads of sweat finally appearing on his forehead despite the heavy air conditioning. Even the court clerk couldn't suppress a chuckle. The arrogance that had sustained Victor for years began to evaporate, replaced by the visible panic of a man watching his empire crumble under the weight of the truth. Amanda leaned toward Tund, her shoulder brushing his, whispering softly, "I told you we don't come to play." Tund, who had spent months feeling like a ghost in his own life, felt a sudden electric surge of vindication. He watched Victor, the man who had stolen his company, his wife, and his dignity, shrink in his seat as Mr. Elvis methodically dismantled every lie. The fire and pepper of the proceedings reached a boiling point when Mr. Elvis produced a series of private emails between Folashade and Victor, proving the coordinated theft of the intellectual property. Back in the village, Matthew had already started calling Tund the senior advocate of the Mechanic Republic, joking that Tund shouldn't forget the small people when he started flying private jets to court. But in the courtroom, the atmosphere was far from a joke. It was a surgical restoration of a man's soul. When the judge finally slammed the gavel, ordering a recall of every unit sold under the stolen design, Victor Muna looked like a man who had finally realized his conscience was dirty, and his time was up. The power had shifted irrevocably, moving from the hands of the architect of shadows and back into the calloused, honest hands of the man who had fixed a billionaire's car for free. His final verdict had been a thunderclap that echoed far beyond the courtroom, granting Brother Tund full intellectual rights and awarding him 72 million naira in damages. Victor Muna's empire was forced to recall every stolen design, and for the first time in years, the evil silence that had followed Tund from Lagos to the village was replaced by the hum of genuine progress. 2 months later, the sleek glass doors of JL Auto Concepts opened in Lekki Phase 1, a space defined by executive gray tones and an air of clinical perfection. The opening night had been a whirlwind of champagne, flashbulbs, and high society handshakes, but as the last of the investors and socialites filtered out into the Lagos night, the clinical perfection of the showroom gave way to something much more real. Amanda Peters sat cross-legged on the polished floor of the main lobby, her designer heels cast aside and her red dress pooling around her like a silken flame. Beside her sat Tund, who had already shed his blazer and was wearing only one sock, the other having mysteriously vanished during the chaotic launch. There were no 5-course meals or crystal flutes between them. Instead, they shared plastic cups filled with red wine and a half-eaten meat pie, the crumbs scattered across the expensive tiles. The silence was comfortable now, a small piece they had built together through court dates and late-night phone calls. Tund raised his plastic cup toward Amanda, his eyes bright with a mixture of exhaustion and profound gratitude. "To the woman who believed in a greasy mechanic from a jetty," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth morning pap register that had first stopped her in her tracks. Amanda clinked her cup against his, her heart full in a way that had nothing to do with real estate portfolios. "To the man who fixed my car and my heart," she countered, her voice dropping to a whisper. They sipped the wine, the humble red tasting better than any vintage Amanda had ever ordered in a boardroom. After a moment, Tund cleared his throat, a sudden nervousness breaking through his calm exterior. He looked around the sleek, expensive room, the product of their shared war, and then looked at the woman beside him. "So, Amanda," he began, his tone shifting into something playful yet deeply serious. "Do you want to go out with me now, or are you still looking for a billionaire boyfriend?" Amanda raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow, a smirk playing on her lips. "Is that even a proposal? In a showroom with no music and a missing sock?" Tund didn't miss a beat. "Ah, can't you see the ambience? We have a dusty floor, empty bottles, and look, there's even a premium gala wrapper right beside your foot. It's the Lagos way." Amanda laughed, a rich, genuine sound that echoed off the glass walls. "Ask me properly, Tund. No billionaire worth her salt accepts a proposal involving gala wrappers." With a dramatic flourish, Tund moved to his knees, almost slipping on the polished tiles in his one remaining sock. He took her hand in his, hands that were still calloused but now clean of the grease that had once defined him. "Amanda Peters," he said, his voice grounding her in the present. "Will you be my girlfriend? I can't promise you skyscrapers, because you already own those. But I can promise to cook slightly burnt jollof rice and love you forever with just enough pepper to keep things interesting." Amanda felt the last of her billionaire tests dissolve into nothingness. She had spent her life measuring people by what they could offer her, but Tund had offered her the one thing she hadn't known she was missing, a place to breathe. She laughed through the tears that pricked at her eyes, leaning forward to close the distance between them. "Yes," she whispered through her giggles. "I've been waiting for you to ask since that first day on the road." Under the flickering fluorescent lights of the Lekki showroom, surrounded by the remnants of a meat pie and the ghost of a gala wrapper, the mechanic and the CEO sealed their alliance with a kiss. It wasn't the ending Amanda had envisioned when her Range Rover first disgraced her in the dust, but it was the one she needed. The test was over, the war was won, and in the heart of the world's most chaotic city, two people had finally found a peace that was built to last.